Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the best science fiction and fantasy erotica anthology podcast in the known universe. This month, Straight Werewolf BDSM. This is episode 477. I am your host, Nobilis Reed. Our author this month is TammyJo Eckhart, PhD. TammyJo has been part of the BDSM scene since 1989. Her nonfiction works cover subjects ranging from history to alternative sexuality to relationship advice and the challenges of trauma recovery. Her fiction work crosses genres including contemporary, fantasy, historical, horror, and science fiction. TammyJo lives in Indiana as head of her poly-kinky household. She has a husband and a slave, both of whom she loves dearly and manages daily. On her Patreon at www.patreon.com/TammyJo Eckhart, you can find exclusive fiction and honest discussions about lifestyle kink. Find a link to her Patreon in the show notes. Our narrator is Vivienne Ferrari, a veteran of the Nobilis Erotica podcast. When I needed to turn this story around quickly, I wanted to put this up for Halloween. I turned to her and I was not disappointed. I don't think you will be either. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. Here we go.
Anything But That. Written by TammyJo Eckhart. That can't be. Darina's whisper froze in her chest as the creature inside the cell snarled and snapped its huge teeth in her direction. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall of the basement and slid down to sit on the floor. She tried to control her breathing, but she just couldn't seem to get a breath at all because there was a knot in her throat. As her eyes adjusted to the dim lights, she identified the creature. A huge wolf. Far bigger than any wolf should be, her rational mind mused. She realized she was overthinking it and calmed down. She released her breath and took a slow, deep one. Using techniques she trained into her submissives when they panicked, she counted out 3 slow breaths, but her body seemed frozen. Jesus! She gasped as the beast thrashed wildly, throwing its body around yet barely moving. Why wasn't it getting any closer to the bars of the cell? She counted her breathing as she watched it struggle. It finally slumped down and stopped moving. Its heavy, ragged breathing was loud in her ears. Its huge head and gaping, fanged mouth turned toward her, and it took in a shuddering breath, nostrils flaring. Was it smelling her? The creature made a whimpering sound and turned its head and the rest of its body awkwardly from her. Darina found her body suddenly free, but she just sat there staring until the beast glanced back at her, whimpering once more before tucking its head as best as it could between its chest and the arm farthest from her. Is it afraid of me? Fight, flight, freeze. Primal responses exist not just in humans, but animals too. Her brain supplied the facts as she got her legs under her. She pressed her hands against the wall to help her stand up. The creature flinched as she stood up. It whined as she took 1, then 2 steps closer. How long were its arms, and was that the right word? Where must she stop so it couldn't reach her if it came at the bars? She took another step, then decided caution was better. Normally she was cautious when approaching new experiences or relationships. She grasped onto her new sub, the reason she was here, to help calm down. They were so compatible. They were both art and pop culture geeks, both business owners, both lovers of comfort over fancy food, and both old enough to know they didn't need kids to be happy in their lives. They only mismatched in one area, and Darina had always seen bondage as more art or function than fun on its own. It had taken a few months, but she had fallen in love, and it felt right. Tonight was a good example of how love sometimes countered her cautiousness.
This is Eric Lowell. I'm unable to answer the phone right now, so leave a message and I'll get back to you in a few days. Thanks.
Darina just ended the call with a frown. She looked at the calendar, then at the other sheet in front of her, filled with notes. She'd been playing with Eric for almost a year. He still wouldn't answer her calls during these mysterious 3 days of every month, nor would he tell her why he, as company vice president, couldn't reschedule. They saw each other every day except for those 3 days. With their first anniversary approaching, she was considering taking their relationship to the next step, but the mystery of those 3 days nagged at her. The main problem was that these 3 days were never the same days, nor were they only once a month. Her note spelled it out clearly, but it was insane. Why would his family business require a full 72 hours of attention the day before, during, and after a full moon? She'd never met his family beyond a sister they'd run into a few months ago. Like Eric, Janelle Lowell was a sporty person, muscular in form, but not bulky. Tall, thick, dark hair, tanned skin, and piercing golden hazel eyes. Darina wasn't small, but she wasn't muscular either, just curvy if she were being generous with her self-assessment. Her coloration showed off her Irish and Scottish ancestry, whereas the Lowells might have been from any of numerous places and fit in easily. "What are you? Some freaks who think they're cryptid hunters?" Darina huffed out loud. "Or are you just an asshole having an affair, or hiding a secret wife and kids?" She'd had a plan to find out tonight, because no one took advantage of a McDaniel. Plus, it wasn't like she'd be breaking and entering. Eric had given her a key to his house. As far as Darina was concerned, getting the truth before she let herself get more emotionally or practically involved with this man was a reason to visit. Darina took a deeper breath and let it out as she looked at the caged beast. This was not what she had wanted to find when she came here an hour ago. She'd driven back and forth a few times, checking the address with the GPS and then paying to use an online search engine to make sure she had the right place. The key he'd given her was an electronic card, and it had let her in through the huge metal gates and into the mansion. His place was not your average place. She knew the Lowells were a business family, but she hadn't realized how big that business was until she saw the estate. She'd been polite, at first. There had been lights on in the house, but no one had answered the door when she used the bell. She had tried the big knocker, but still no one came. She had used the key card and walked inside, and a computer voice had greeted her by name. See, she wasn't being nosy. She was just a concerned girlfriend and dominant, right? She'd called out, looked around for a while, listening for anything. A scraping noise had drawn her attention to a door that turned out to lead down to the basement. The lights here were dim, so she'd turned on the flashlight she kept on her car's key fob to walk down, even though she should have known from her love of horror movies not to do it. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life. So other than finding Eric or a mouse, what honestly might be down here? The scraping had gotten louder until she'd come face to face with a wall. Looking around, she frowned. This wasn't a full basement? Then she'd spied the switch on the wall. It looked like another light switch, so she'd flipped it, gripping her flashlight tightly. The wall had slid back to reveal several pegs on the wall and a bench opposite it. Men's clothing hung on the pegs, men's boots under the bench. The scraping stopped. "Hello? Eric? It's Darina. I was, worried about you because you didn't answer any texts," she offered as she walked inside. With each step, she got braver. "Look, we've been seeing each other for 11 months now, and this not telling me what you do these 3 days feels wrong. I think we need to have a—" That's when she'd seen the cell and the creature in it. Her mind flipped. Now, rational thought returned, so she looked around and found her flashlight a few steps away. She snatched it up and pointed it inside the cell, bracing for the thing to start struggling again. But it just whined and tried to turn farther away. The light helped her see it better. There were gray bands around its chest and waist, on its ankles and on its wrists. It was sitting like a person would, not like an animal, one leg pulled up a bit to try and cover the front of its body. His body. There was a slightly swollen area in the groin, but nothing else visible. "Son of a bitch," Darina whispered. The beast whimpered. "Not you, Wolfie," she offered weakly with a shrug. "Not you. The man who captured you and left you down here. I knew he was keeping secrets. I saw the dates, the full moons, but really? To go hunting for werewolves?" The creature turned its head toward her, its golden hazel eyes looking at her sadly. Darina gripped the flashlight tighter. No. No, it could not be. It couldn't. She started backing up, shaking her head. The beast whimpered and bowed its head to her, letting its legs fall open, exposing itself fully to her, a mimicry of one of her favorite sexy positions. She started to scream, but pressed a hand over her mouth. In a few moments, she calmed down and uncovered her mouth. She looked around, eyes darting back to the cell as she searched for anything she could use as a chair. There was a box and a mini-fridge along the other wall. Those eyes followed her as she moved. He moved his body enough to show her that he wasn't hiding from her. She tested the sturdiness of the box with her booted foot, then sat down to look at him for a long moment. "It's okay, Eric. I'm going to wait here with you until morning, or whenever you change back. We're going to be okay. We will," she stated as firmly as she could. At some point she fell asleep, because she woke up with a jerk of her body, moaning when she felt how stiff her neck and shoulders were. It was brighter, but some buzzing noise had woken her up. The sound of a throat clearing made her look toward the cell. There he was, her submissive. The bands that held him in place as a wolf thing looked huge on him, but he was displayed as he had been last night when she'd recognized him. She just looked at him, but he didn't look up until she ordered, "Look at me, Eric." Her voice sounded harsh, and she frowned. She fumbled for the mini-fridge and found a couple of bottles of water, juice, and protein shakes. She took the waters and stood up. "Can you release yourself?" He nodded, and she growled in her throat as she took a sip from one of the bottles. "I don't read minds, Eric. Use your words."
"Yes, they are on a timer. Mistress?"
His voice was raspy-sounding. Darina closed her eyes and counted out a couple of breaths before opening them. "Since bondage is one of your hard limits, I don't want to talk to you while you are in it. I've gotten you some water. Once you're dressed, come upstairs to the kitchen." She set the unopened bottle on the top of the mini-fridge and made herself walk past the cell with calculated steps, her head held high, her arms swinging with purpose. She kept up the farce until she was upstairs and could lean down on the kitchen island, which had 8 bar stools along one side. "Oh my, I don't even know what deity to appeal to here," she whispered into the marble countertop. Maybe he was a magician, and this was an elaborate act he was practicing? "That is the dumbest thing you've ever thought, Dari," she told herself. She stopped talking out loud when she heard footsteps approaching. A quick wipe of her eyes with the back of a hand, then she turned around. She posed as casually as possible against the island, drinking from the water bottle in slow but steady sips. She lowered it when Eric stepped into view. He froze, then spread his legs shoulder-width apart, hands at the small of his back, head bowed again. They were both silent for several minutes. "You gave me the key to your place." Even as she said the words, they sounded weird to her, but she kept talking as though everything was normal. I just needed to know what has been going on before. We've been together for almost a year. I think it's time for the next step, or to move on. He flinched and hunched inward a bit, but she didn't stop. Look, I can't make a decision like that when you've been keeping keeping this from me. I decided I needed to know. You gave me the key, she tossed out. He nodded a few times, then spoke softly.
I did that. I must have wanted you to find out.
Darina blinked in surprise at the admission. It justified what she'd been telling herself.
Now you know, so just tell me when, and I'll get anything I have at your house.
No, she interrupted him. He looked up at her then, and she could see the tears in his eyes and on his cheeks.
But you know.
I've seen, but I don't know. We haven't talked about this because you didn't tell me anything, so I can't really know enough. Not to make that sort of choice, she told him with a sigh. She felt so tired and wired at the same time.
But you know I'm a monster.
Are you? He just looked at her, then started to turn his gaze away until she snapped. Eyes on me. We're talking about something serious. He opened his mouth, then closed it. What?
Yes, mistress, he offered.
Darina reached back to brace her free hand on the countertop as the title and his tone stirred up a different set of confusing feelings. She set down the bottle and used the movement to jab her nails into the palm of her hand, just hard enough to curb her arousal. What exactly are you? He just looked at her with a frown. Is werewolf correct?
That's fine,
he began, but she gave him one of her annoyed looks, so he added,
We just call ourselves the first ones. A bit arrogant,
he snorted, then quickly lost a smile. First ones, she repeated. Are you human, then?
That's a complicated mythological and scientific question, he replied with a shrug.
Darina squeezed the countertop behind her, then pushed off to take a couple of steps toward him. He flinched and froze in place like he was scared of her. Her big, strong man, who wasn't just a man, was afraid of her, and not in a fun, orgasmic way. It's Saturday. I had nothing planned. I have all day for you to help me know what you are. He swallowed, then bowed his head briefly before meeting her gaze.
May I make us breakfast, then? I want to still call you mistress.
I didn't tell you to stop, Darina said. It was complicated. Eric got out old books and records to show her as he talked, and she asked questions. His family had come to the New World early in the 18th century to escape persecution, as many had, but they'd had wealth and titles to start and turned them to their advantage. Witches had taken the brunt of religious fears, but later, as would-be scholars roamed the wilds, they'd started reporting unusual creatures. It became time for the Lowells to leave. His family had been here ever since, spreading out across the continent. The sister she'd met was technically the family heir, since contrary to popular tropes, first ones, or werewolves, were matriarchal. Is that why you like being the bottom in kink? Darina asked after that revelation. Eric blew out a long breath.
No, aside from the politics and family inheritance, we're more egalitarian, if you think fighting for who will be on top qualifies.
Darina frowned and sat back in the chair she was seated in next to Eric on the couch in his library. After breakfast, he gave her a house tour. I'm staying here to watch this thing happen. I need to know more, she'd insisted. But he just nodded and put his hands in his front pockets, hunching in on himself again. He called one of his assistants to have the woman pick up some things from Darina's house to bring here for her. While he did that, she used her smartphone to place an order for another item. This weekend was make or break for them, so what was one more risky idea? It should come before the full moon rose, she hoped.
I can keep going with my family tree if you want, but that's pretty much it for around here,
Eric said after a few silent moments. Is this why you made bondage a hard limit? Darina asked. Because you have to lock yourself up or you'd what?
Damage the house, tackle a deer, stalk a human, get hit by a car. If it can happen, it has happened to someone in my family. This is just what I was taught to do.
It makes more sense now. It was always a bit unusual because most bottoms and submissives love bondage.
Something you gave up for me,
Eric whispered. Darina put a hand on his arm and squeezed gently. Hey, less work for me, really. But turning something you have to do into something you want to do, that's difficult. It's like the coffee I force myself to drink at 3 p.m. just to get through the next couple hours of work makes me hate drinking coffee at any other time.
Talk about weird,
Eric tossed out with a smile. He chuckled when she swatted his arm, so she shook her head and laughed too. There's the Eric I love spending time with.
I wanted to tell you, mistress. I almost did after you met Janelle, but I'm...
He sighed and stood up to pace a few steps before turning back to her.
I'm a coward.
Darina stood up and put her hands on her hips. You're afraid. That's not being a coward, that's being a person. I wanted a person, not an object.
You didn't want a puppy, he retorted.
Darina pushed down the bubble of anger starting to boil up in her stomach and walked right up to him. You didn't ask me if I did, because you didn't tell me. I might not have believed you, but if you'd shown me, how could I not?
I thought for sure you'd just run.
I'll be honest, I just froze when I saw you, but then when you started to calm down and reacted to me...
He reacted to you?
You don't remember?
I only have vague memories when I'm lunar shifted. Mostly feelings, blurry images.
But you can choose to shift, not just when you're forced by the moon's phase, she said, paraphrasing earlier information. When he nodded, she asked, Do you remember when you choose?
Oh, yeah, I can understand everything. I don't really do that.
She was about to ask more questions when there was a pinging sound from nearby. Eric held up a hand in apology and went to push a button on one wall near a small screen.
Delivery for a Darina McDaniel, another voice said.
Eric turned toward her, so Darina explained. I ordered something. I did warn you that giving me your house key might make me feel like I had a right to call it my own, she teased.
Of course,
he simply said before speaking into the intercom.
I'll fetch it for you, mistress,
he told her before walking out of the room toward the front door. Darina put a hand on her chest, feeling her heart race. Make or break time. Eric came back with the package and handed it to her.
Do you need a box opener?
I have something that will work, she said, and got out the mini multi-purpose tool she also kept on her keyring. She weighed the box in her hands, then ran one of the blades on the tool over the tape, but didn't open it. After placing the ring back in her pocket, she held the box up to Eric. I got this for you. Please don't freak out. He took it but eyed her as he pulled back the cardboard flaps. He looked inside, then back at her.
That's huge.
You're huge in that other form,
What are you saying exactly?
Darina took a deep breath, then huffed it out with a flood of words before she could back down. We are approaching a year together, and I have loved being your mistress. But this isn't a game to me. This is how I love. I want to love all of you, even the parts you need to lock down. I think your lunar self still recognized me, and I think you will feel safer in my collar in that form too. Eric took out the bright yellow leather collar and tossed the box onto the nearest chair.
If I wore this before I changed, it might not fit right.
I thought I'd put it on you myself, as is proper, when that time comes. He stared at the collar, then at her.
Are you crazy? I could kill you with one bite.
He turned and started walking quickly out of the room and down the hallway, the collar grasped in his hand. Darina raced to keep up with him. Collars are the one form of bondage you do like, even though you didn't want a locking one for obvious reasons now, she said as they marched through the house.
Can't you see how dangerous this would be? I couldn't live with myself if he harmed you.
I don't think you will, moon or not, Darina stated. She stopped. After a few steps, he did as well, turning toward her. Last night, once I stood up and started talking, you acted like you knew me. You smelled me, and then your behavior completely changed. It was that and your eyes that made me see what you were. Eric, you are terrified of what you could do when you are like that. I am too, but I took a vow to protect you, to guide you, to be your dominant. Period. Wolf or man, it shouldn't matter. He just stood there for several minutes until he nodded, clutching the new collar to his chest. Darina watched Eric take off his clothing, get into the cell, and then sit down to fit under the metal straps.
This is turning you on?
He asked with a wary frown. You can smell that, huh? She replied, squeezing her legs together and feeling her face grow hotter.
He'll be able to smell it much better.
She didn't contradict him. If she was right, their lives were about to change. She wouldn't just be the femdom with the handsomest man at regional kink events, but also the one who owned a werewolf. She couldn't stop using that term in her head. She'd have to work on that. If he was right, their lives would change too, but she wouldn't have to worry about that then. It was unfair in so many ways, but he'd submitted to her decision. She had to carry it out now. The bands hissed, then clanked as they fastened down over him. Darina stood in the doorway of the cell, knowing that once she moved, it too would lock.
You have the water and the pillow and blanket, mistress?
Eric asked. He was sitting up ramrod straight, looking at her. Yep. She shrugged the shoulder that held the backpack he'd insisted she bring into the cell.
Don't move further inside until he's calmed down. Please,
Eric begged. Darina nodded and moved her feet to stand firmly in the doorway. Watching the change nearly triggered her flight response, but she just clenched her hand around the yellow collar and pushed all her thoughts toward good Eric, good boy, and variations of that. It was clear he was in so much pain as his body contorted and his screams turned to howls. Yet he loved pain in his human form, loved pushing himself and her just a bit further whenever they got the SM toys out. When the change was complete, the creature didn't thrash about. It sat still, eyes fixed on hers. Eric, it's me, Mistress Darina. You know me, right? That's it. Sniff the air. It did so, and the area where the groin was started to swell. He told her about the sheath and how arousal worked with first ones. but seeing it made her pause. Lunar Eric spread his legs and arms out as widely as he could and whimpered at her. "See, you remember more than you think. You remember I got you this." She held up the collar. He lifted his head up and bared his throat to her, a sign of submission among the first ones, he'd told her. "I'm coming toward you to put it on you. You are not going to bite me. You are not going to scratch me. You are not going to do anything but let me put this on you." "That's a good Eric," Darina said as she started to move forward. The door shut and locked behind her. His golden eyes looked down for a moment until she repeated her orders. He was big, about 20% larger than Eric in man form was, but still not as huge as he'd seemed last night. His fur was softer than it had looked, dark and thick where it brushed against her hands. "That's a good Eric. Keep still," she said as she let the backpack swing against her spine and opened up the yellow leather collar. They both held their breath as she buckled it around his neck. She moved it slightly, centering the D-ring in front. "You look like such a good Eric," she told him as she stepped back and away from him. Her eyes swept down his body, and she could see the dark top of his cock now poking out of the sheath. "Don't get too excited. Good boy. We won't be doing that while you're in this form," she told him. She moved over toward the door so she could sit opposite him. She took out the pillow and placed it against the bars of the cell, then unfolded the blanket enough to lay it on the concrete floor to sit on. He whimpered and ducked his head down, but kept his eyes on her. "How about I talk to you?" she asked, before launching into a story about a particularly delightful client at her shop. Darina startled at the buzzing noise and groaned when she moved to find her shoulders a bit stiff. She was slumped down against the pillow, but mostly sitting up. Not an ideal way to sleep, but better than last night. She opened her eyes and blinked at Eric, laid out as he had been before the change, his body in the restraints, though they should have opened by now. The yellow collar was dangling loosely around his neck.
"Good morning, mistress,"
he croaked out with a tight smile. "Why didn't you get up?" she asked as she stumbled to her feet and snatched up the backpack. She'd drunk only 1 bottle of water last night, so there was plenty left. She dropped the pack and walked to him, uncapping the bottle. "Here, sip slowly," she ordered as she knelt and held the bottle to his lips. After a few swallows, she recapped the bottle and sat back on her heels to study him. She tapped on the metal over his left arm. "Did the locks not work?"
"They are open, but I thought—"
Eric paused and tilted his hips toward her, showing off his erection.
"Since you stayed, maybe you'd be interested."
He sniffed the air but said nothing, though his cheeks reddened a bit. His wolf senses explained a lot about how he knew she was in the mood, she realized. It was true that she was really turned on at the sight of him subtly restrained, naked, and clearly ready. But she needed to be certain. Bondage is your hard limit. Even unlocked, it's still restraints. Eric pressed his lips together for a moment.
"You risked your life last night, and I think you might be right about me remembering more, because I'm pretty sure you told me a hot story or 3 last night." She chuckled in confirmation, but urged him on. "And?" "And I think bondage may be a soft limit now, given how hard I am at the thought of you just straddling and riding me until you scream."
Darina waited only a moment before grinning. "A ride would be a great way to start the day." Once she was naked and straddling his lap, his fullness inside her, she kissed him and whispered, "Don't move. Good boy. His eyes seemed to sparkle as she started to move. She braced herself on the wall behind him and on the metal band over his stomach. They kept their eyes locked as she slowly worked his cock.
Mistress, I want to touch you,
he groaned. Stay still, she ordered. She took her hand off the metal and stroked her clit faster and faster. Her arm fell from the wall to pull him closer as she came with a yell that surprised her. She felt her body relax with each jolt of her orgasm. He whimpered against her kiss, still hard and wanting, but she just chuckled. Not yet, Wolfie. Darina rode him 2 more times, each orgasm taking a bit longer and never letting him come. Her thighs were starting to tremble from the position. She moved so that her legs nearly wrapped around him, then lowered herself so he was deep inside once more. Eric's breathing was jagged, moist against her face as she laid her cheek against his.
Please, mistress,
he whimpered. Make me scream 1 more time, then you can come, she directed into his ear before nibbling at it. He wasted no time in pulling one arm out of the loose band and wrapping it around her waist to rest at the small of her back. He used his supernaturally strong muscles to thrust into her while he pulled her close so his firm abs rubbed her clit. It didn't take her long this time, as she used her own hands to scratch at his shoulders and back, her teeth to bite along his neck, and her mouth to add a few choice words to the mix. She was riding a werewolf. She was in control, and that knowledge made her scream out in triumph. When they calmed down, they merely separated enough to cuddle silently for a few moments.
I may like Wolfie a bit more than I should,
Eric confessed. Darina chuckled, then winced. I think I said you were my bitch. That might have been a poor word choice.
I wouldn't want my family to hear you call me that, but it wasn't the first time you've done it either,
he reminded her. Darina looked up at him and placed a hand on his face. I don't want to offend your family. I want them to like me.
Really?
Really. Darina pulled back and got to her feet. She looked down at the man she loved. Eric, I want to continue this. Do you? He got onto his knees and rose so that he could look up into her eyes.
I just gave up a hard limit for you, mistress.
Yeah, you did. Darina leaned down and kissed him, one hand gripping his chin firmly while the other threaded through his hair. My Wolfie.
Yours,
he whispered against her lips. They leaned sweat-coated forehead to forehead and just enjoyed the moment that marked the start of the rest of their lives.
And that's our story. This episode is sponsored by Literotica, the world's most popular online community of self-published erotic authors and readers for over 20 years. Check out their Adult Creators podcast at literoticapodcast.com or find it in your favorite podcatcher. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this podcast, head to patreon.com/nobilis. As a supporter, you will have access to a personal RSS feed that you can drop into your podcatcher. And if you want monthly bonus content, bump up your support to $3 a month. And finally, remember to pick up Monster Whisperer Second Class in your favorite ebook retailer or on the Riverdale Avenue Books website. Or pick up the audiobook on Audible, Amazon, or Apple. Your support will help ensure this series continues. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is composed and performed by Mass Relay. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.